The mountains did not fall. That is the part Iran wants you to focus on. The tunnels are still there. The rock is still there. Decades of engineering, billions of dollars in construction, corridor after corridor carved deep into the sedimentary formations beneath Keshem Island. All of it is still physically intact. And that is precisely the story Iranian state media is telling its population, its regional allies, and anyone willing to listen. Here is what that story leaves out. A fortress whose exits have been welded shut from the outside is not a fortress anymore. It is a tomb. And what has been unfolding along Iran's southern coastline from late February through the morning of May 10, 2026, is something far more strategically devastating than a destroyed bunker. It is the methodical, systematic sealing of the most important military architecture Iran has built in the past 3 decades, from the outside in, exit by exit, corridor by corridor, commander by commander, until the weapons inside those mountains can no longer reach the world they were designed to threaten. That distinction, sealed versus destroyed, is the one that almost nobody in mainstream coverage is stopping to explain, and it may be the single most consequential military development in the Persian Gulf since the tanker wars of the 1980s. I want you to understand exactly what that means. Not at the level of weapons systems and targeting coordinates, at the level of what it means for the global economy, for the diplomatic talks in Islamabad, for the 3 carrier strike groups currently positioned in the Gulf, and for Iran's ability to end this crisis on any terms that resemble a dignified exit. Because all of those things are now directly connected to one question that Iranian military commanders are asking in sealed rooms they hope the Americans haven't mapped yet. How many of our missiles can actually get out? Let me take you back to the doctrine first, because the doctrine is everything. For 30 years, Iran's military planners made a strategic bet that most Western analysts underestimated. The bet was simple in principle, staggering in execution. Whatever you can target on the surface, you cannot reach underground. That was the foundational logic of what Iran called its missile cities. Vast subterranean networks excavated beneath the mountains and islands of its southern coastline, designed to house hundreds of anti-ship cruise missiles, transporter erector launchers, command centers, and resupply depots in a geological environment that conventional airpower simply could not penetrate. Keshem Island, sitting just 22 kilometers south of the port city of Bandar Abbas, became the centerpiece of this architecture. The island sits at the narrowest point of the Clarence Strait, which feeds directly into the Strait of Hormuz. Whoever controls the geography of Keshem controls the pressure point through which 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day. The IRGC understood that. They built accordingly. What emerged beneath Keshem was not a storage facility. It was an operational military system. Think of the scale for a moment. Underground tunnels extending for dozens of kilometers, automated rail networks moving missiles from assembly areas to staging corridors, multiple exit points designed with redundancy and deception, false entrances engineered to absorb strikes while real exits remained concealed, ventilation systems, command bunkers, intelligence nodes linked to coastal radar networks that could track shipping movements in real time. Resupply routes connecting the tunnel network to fuel depots, maintenance crews, and the logistical chains that keep weapon systems functional over months of potential conflict. And the weapons themselves were serious. Anti-ship cruise missiles capable of striking targets over 1,000 kilometers away, the Noor, the Qadr, the Ghadir 380, the upgraded Silkworm variants for close-range tanker strikes, the IRGC's fast inshore attack craft, what they internally call the Red Wasps, staged for swarming operations against naval assets attempting to transit the strait. In January of 2026, IRGC Navy Commander Alireza Tangsiri walked the cameras of Iranian state television directly into these facilities. He stood in the tunnel corridors, surrounded by rows of cruise missiles prepared for launch, and delivered a message to Washington with complete confidence. The IRGC Navy, he said, possessed a network of missile tunnels beneath the sea, built specifically to confront American naval forces operating in the Gulf and the Sea of Oman. The Strait of Hormuz, he declared, was under complete Iranian control across air, surface, and subsurface domains. That broadcast was intended as a warning. What it actually became was a targeting package. Here is where the strategic picture shifts in a way that most coverage has missed entirely. When we talk about the strikes that have been carried out against Iran's coastal missile infrastructure since late February 2026, the natural assumption is that the goal was destruction: take out the tunnels, collapse the facilities, eliminate the weapons. That is how air campaigns are conventionally understood, and that is how Iranian propaganda has framed the strikes, as attacks that failed to reach the buried arsenal, leaving the missiles intact and Iran's deterrent credible. But the targeting logic that American and Israeli planners actually employed was fundamentally different. And understanding that difference is what unlocks the entire strategic picture of where Iran stands today. You do not need to destroy a tunnel to neutralize it. You need to destroy its connection to the outside world, the exits, the ventilation shafts, the resupply corridors, the above-ground staging areas where transporter erector launchers are brought out, armed, and oriented before a firing sequence begins, the command nodes that link the underground system to the coastal radar network, the communication infrastructure that tells a launcher crew where the target is, what the weather is, what the threat environment looks like before they emerge into open air. Destroy those, and you have not touched the weapons. The missiles remain exactly where they are, perfectly preserved in their underground storage conditions, technically intact, physically real, and completely inaccessible. The mountain protected them, and now the mountain has become their prison. This is what has been executed along Iran's southern coastline, not a frontal assault on the geological architecture of the tunnel network itself, a surgical campaign against the interface between that network and the battlefield surface it was built to influence. On March 17th, U.S. Central Command confirmed it had deployed multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions, the GBU-72, a precision bunker buster optimized specifically for hardened and buried target sets, against Iranian missile facilities along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. The strikes hit infrastructure the IRGC had just revealed by using it. The targeting was not guesswork, it was forensic. Every facility struck corresponded directly to a location that Iranian forces had exposed by activating. The bomb pier at Keshem Island was hit. The IRGC naval complex at Bandar Abbas took its second strike of the conflict. The smaller coastal nodes at Sirak and Bandar Kamir, the outer ring of Iran's sea denial architecture, were targeted with precision that reflected weeks of accumulated intelligence. And each of those strikes, as assessed through satellite imagery and open-source intelligence analysis, was not primarily a destruction event. It was an architectural surgery performed on the points where Iran's buried arsenal meets the surface environment those weapons need in order to matter. The results, as of this moment, are stark. In June of 2025, before Operation Epic Fury even began, before the largest American naval buildup in the Persian Gulf in a generation had fully assembled, Israeli forces conducted what intelligence officials described as a launcher hunt. 293 active Iranian launchers were targeted. 95 of them were inside tunnel openings and access shafts that collapsed under the strikes. That is not a marginal number. That is a structural degradation of Iran's ability to execute the salvo doctrine its coastal defense system was designed around. And then the conflict escalated beyond that baseline. By later Israeli assessment, approximately 200 additional launchers were destroyed in subsequent strikes, with another 80 rendered non-operational after strikes collapsed the tunnel entrances to the sub-training facilities where they are housed. When you add the figures disclosed in a closed-door briefing that the Israeli National Security Advisor delivered to the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in June 2025, the picture becomes almost impossible to dismiss. Iran began the conflict with approximately 2,500 ballistic missiles. More than 500 had been launched at Israel, but the figure that should have been in every headline in the world was the third number. An estimated 800 missiles were assessed as potentially trapped within tunnel networks damaged by the strikes. 800 missiles, not destroyed, not intercepted, trapped, buried alive inside fortresses that were designed to protect them, now preventing them from functioning in the only way that matters, as deployable weapons. That is the third state of a buried arsenal that Western media has largely failed to account for. The coverage defaults to binary. Either the tunnels are invulnerable and Iran retains full deterrent capability, or the tunnels have been destroyed and the threat has been eliminated, but sealed, still intact, physically undamaged in its geological core, but cut off from the battlefield by the systematic elimination of its operational interface. That is the state that changes everything, and it is the state that describes a substantial portion of Iran's coastal missile inventory right now. Now consider the human dimension of this, because the tunnel network is not a mechanical storage system, it is a military organism. It requires commanders who understand its operational protocols, intelligence officers who can translate real-time tracking data into targeting solutions before a launch window closes, maintenance crews who understand the specific calibration requirements of weapons that have been sitting in temperature and humidity-controlled underground environments, communication specialists who maintain the encrypted links between the tunnel exits and the broader coastal radar network, and at the top of all of that, a command layer with the authority, the situational awareness, and the institutional confidence to make coordinated strategic decisions under the kind of pressure that 3 carrier strike groups impose. On March 26th, that command layer ceased to exist. The IDF confirmed the killing of IRGC Navy Commander Ali Reza Tangsiri in a strike at Bandar Abbas while he was meeting with senior commanders. Alongside Tangsiri, the strike eliminated IRGC Navy Intelligence Chief Banem Rezaei and the rest of the top naval leadership. In a single operation, the entire upper tier of the organization that knew the tunnel network's operational protocols, the exit schedules, the firing sequences, the abort procedures, the tactical decision trees that governed when and how coastal missiles were deployed, was removed from the battlefield. Tangsiri was not simply a commander. He was the architect of the IRGC's current coastal denial doctrine. He was the man who had personally orchestrated the integration of the missile cities with the swarm boat tactics and the sea mining operations that briefly closed the strait to non-Iranian shipping in the opening weeks of Operation Epic Fury. He was the man who stood in those tunnel corridors on state television in January and declared total dominance. He understood the system at a level that cannot be rebuilt quickly, because that understanding was the product of decades of operational experience inside a program that very few people in the world have ever been allowed to see. He is gone. His intelligence chief is gone. The organizational layer that connected the underground arsenal to a coherent strategic vision no longer exists in its original form. What replaced it is the decentralized mosaic defense model, authority distributed across provincial IRGC units, and regional commanders who were designed to maintain local resistance in the event of a full leadership decapitation. That architecture has resilience built into it. But resilience in a decentralized structure comes at the cost of coherence. And without coherence, a distributed missile network does not become a sophisticated strategic tool. It becomes an unpredictable reflex. That is the environment in which the events of May 7, 2026 unfolded. On the morning of May 7th, USS Truxtun, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Mason were transiting the Strait of Hormuz toward the Gulf of Oman. Iranian forces launched a coordinated attack, drones, cruise missiles, and fast inshore attack craft simultaneously. CENTCOM confirmed the strikes were unprovoked. No American assets were hit, 0 damage, 0 casualties on the American side. Every inbound threat was destroyed in the air or sunk before making contact with an American hull. The Aegis combat system performed. The AH-64 Apache and MH-60 Seahawk platforms eliminated the small boat component of the swarm before it could close to engagement range. The operational doctrine that IRGC naval planners spent 30 years developing, saturate the defensive envelope with multiple threat vectors simultaneously, exploit the gap between detection and response, overwhelm the tracking and engagement capacity of a ship's radar and weapon systems, failed completely in its first test against the full weight of an American carrier-led task force. Not one drone made contact, not one cruise missile got through, not one fast attack boat reached its target. And the entire engagement was recorded, assessed, and broadcast by American Naval Command before Iranian state media had assembled its counter-narrative. But I want you to look at the May 7th attack from a different angle, not as a military operation, as a symptom. The weapons that Iran deployed on May 7th were not the weapons it had planned to use in this kind of engagement. They were the weapons it could still reach. The surface launchers that had survived the preceding 10 weeks of strikes, the systems whose exit architecture had not yet been fully sealed, the inventory that remained accessible rather than the inventory that remained impressive. The IRGC was not operating from tactical confidence, it was operating from shrinking options, and simultaneously, on the same day the destroyers were attacked, Iran announced the establishment of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a body claiming the right to grant or deny transit permission through the Strait of Hormuz and collect tolls from vessels seeking passage. Lloyd's List intelligence confirmed that shipping firms had received application forms directly from this body. The firm also reported that no transits had taken place since May 4th and described the strait as effectively closed. Think about what Iran was doing in those hours. Claiming bureaucratic sovereignty over an international waterway with one hand, launching a military attack it demonstrably could not sustain with the other, asserting regulatory control in the diplomatic documents while exposing the degraded state of the arsenal that was supposed to enforce that control in the physical world. That is not the behavior of a power operating from strength. That is the behavior of a power attempting to maintain the appearance of leverage, while the foundation of that leverage is being quietly excavated beneath it. The global economic consequences of what has happened to those tunnels and to that strait are not abstract. They are being paid right now, daily, by people who have no connection to the geopolitical dispute itself. Before the conflict began, approximately 3,000 vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz each month. As of May 10th, that number stands at roughly 5% of that baseline. Approximately 2,000 ships are stranded in the Persian Gulf, sitting at anchor with cargo the world needs, unable to move in either direction. Brent crude reached an intraday peak above $126 per barrel in late April, the highest level since the early weeks of the Russia-Ukraine war. The Vitol CEO estimated in late April that 1 billion barrels of oil production would be lost because of the conflict, with current losses already between 600 and 700 million barrels. The maritime blockade did not only affect energy markets. Gulf Cooperation Council states, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, rely on the strait for more than 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted. These are not statistical abstractions. These are families paying emergency prices for basic food in countries that have no geographic alternative to a waterway that is now controlled by a regime in the middle of a war. And there is a detail buried in the situation that is perhaps the most revealing single piece of information about Iran's actual operational condition. According to one report, Iran had lost track of mines it had planted in the Strait of Hormuz and was therefore unable to fully reopen the waterway, even if it decided to. A military organization that cannot account for its own naval mines has lost command coherence in a way that no propaganda broadcast can paper over. A military that launches a coordinated swarm attack and achieves zero damage to the enemy has lost offensive capability it was designed around. A military whose top naval commanders are dead and whose tunnel exits are progressively sealed has lost the organizational depth to reconstitute quickly. That is the reality beneath the continued official assertions that the missile cities remain intact and the deterrent remains credible. The tunnels did survive. That part is true. But survival without access is not deterrence. It is storage. And Iran is not in a war where expensive storage helps it. The talks in Islamabad collapsed on April 12, when J.D. Vance announced that agreement could not be reached after a day of negotiations. Days later, Trump announced a naval blockade of the strait. American forces would prevent ships from entering or exiting and would intercept vessels that had paid tolls to Iran. On May 4th, Operation Project Freedom was launched to escort merchant ships out of the Gulf. On May 6th, Trump paused the operation, citing progress toward a possible agreement. Less than 24 hours later, Iranian forces attacked 3 American destroyers. The ceasefire that Pakistani diplomats had spent weeks constructing was being violated on the water at the same moment it was supposedly being negotiated in conference rooms. And this is where the internal fragmentation of Iranian military command becomes not just a military problem, but a diplomatic one. The May 7th attack may not have been a strategic decision authorized by Iran's supreme leadership. The available evidence suggests it may have been a local IRGC naval commander operating from a partially compromised coastal base with access to whatever surface launch capability had survived 10 weeks of strikes, making a tactical decision that the decapitated chain of command above him no longer had the coherence to prevent. That is the most dangerous type of military action in a fragile diplomatic environment. Not a calculated escalation, not a strategic signal deliberately crafted to move a negotiation, an institutional breakdown expressing itself through weapons. A military system in managed decline producing kinetic actions not because a rational actor decided they were strategically optimal, but because the reflexes of a 30-year-old doctrine are still running inside a command structure that no longer has the leadership to regulate those reflexes. Secretary of State Rubio stated it clearly. The United States cannot accept a system in which Tehran decides who uses an international waterway and what they must pay to use it. That is the American red line, not just the military one, but the legal, economic, and geopolitical one. Iran cannot keep the toll booth. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority announced on May 7th is not something the United States will permit to become a permanent institution. And the military instruments enforcing that position, 3 carrier strike groups, F-35C squadrons flying continuous air superiority missions, Aegis destroyers, Apache platforms hunting swarm boats, bunker-penetrating munitions that have already demonstrated their willingness to work on coastal exit architecture, remain fully deployed and operational. Iran faces a compounding institutional crisis that extends far beyond the military dimension. At the same moment, it is trying to fund the reconstruction of collapsed tunnel exits and maintain enough coastal deterrence to negotiate from something resembling a position of credibility. It is dealing with 60% inflation, the collapse of basic public services, oil export revenues effectively severed by the American counter-blockade, and what analysts describe as historic waves of civil protest rooted in the economic catastrophe the conflict has accelerated. The regime's response to the domestic pressure has been extraordinary in the worst possible sense. A campaign of unprecedented repression that peaked in January and February of 2026, with estimates placing the death toll from internal suppression in the tens of thousands. A government that is killing its own population at that scale to maintain control is a government that has crossed beyond the threshold of political crisis into something closer to institutional survival mode. And a government in institutional survival mode cannot simultaneously rebuild sophisticated military infrastructure, fund the logistical reconstruction of sealed coastal tunnel systems, and conduct the kind of sophisticated diplomacy required to extract itself from a conflict that has gone catastrophically wrong. These are not separate problems. They compete for the same resources, the same administrative bandwidth, the same leadership attention, in a system whose top leadership has already been hollowed out by precisely targeted strikes. 3 arenas are determining what happens next, and they are running simultaneously. In the diplomatic arena, Pakistan is still attempting to mediate. The reopening of the strait remains the central demand, not just an American demand, but a global economic one that every shipping firm, every energy importer, and every government watching its growth projections collapse is pressing for. Iran's position in those talks depends on how much military leverage it credibly still possesses, and that credibility is directly connected to the physical question of how many coastal missiles can actually emerge from their tunnels. In the economic arena, the clock is running against Iran in ways that cannot be negotiated away. Oilfield infrastructure deteriorates when it sits idle. The revenue the Iranian government needs to fund both its military and its domestic obligations is being choked off by the American counter-blockade. Every day the strait remains closed is another day that the economic conditions inside Iran become harder to manage without further repression. And further repression means further domestic instability. And in the physical arena, beneath the mountains of southern Iran, engineering crews are attempting to reopen tunnel exits under conditions of complete American air superiority at a cost and pace that the collapsing Iranian economy may not be able to sustain. Every meter of collapsed tunnel that needs to be cleared is a meter cleared under the assumption that the surveillance assets watching it from above will immediately relay that information to a targeting system capable of collapsing it again. This is where the strategic situation sits on the morning of May 10, 2026. Iran built its missile cities across 30 years of excavation, investment, and doctrinal commitment. It built them to be invulnerable, and in the narrow geological sense they are. The mountains are intact. The weapons inside them are physically real. The engineering achievement represents a genuine military accomplishment that Western analysts respect even as they work to neutralize it. But the doctrine that those missile cities were built to execute, the doctrine of going underground, staying invulnerable, and emerging to threaten the global economy through the Strait of Hormuz at will, that doctrine has been severed from its operational capability, not by destroying the fortresses, by sealing them, by eliminating the interface between the arsenal and the battlefield, one exit point, one ventilation shaft, one command node, one commander at a time, over 10 weeks of the most consequential sustained aerial campaign the Persian Gulf has witnessed in a generation. A missile locked inside a mountain is not a deterrent. It is an inventory item that cannot be deployed. It is leverage that cannot be exercised. It is a threat that cannot be executed. And a regime whose entire negotiating position rests on the threat of what it can still do to the world's most critical maritime choke point cannot negotiate from missiles it cannot reach. Iran's tunnels survived. That is the answer to the question the IRGC has been asking its engineers every day of this conflict. But the question that matters now, the one being asked in every government that depends on the strait remaining open, in every shipping firm with vessels stranded at anchor, in every capital monitoring the diplomatic channel through Islamabad, is a different question entirely. Survival without access is not the same thing as deterrence. And until Iran can demonstrate otherwise, until those exits reopen, until missiles can move from the mountain to the water, until the coastal firing doctrine can be executed under conditions of American and Israeli air superiority rather than just threatened from behind sealed tunnel doors, the world is watching a military whose foundational strategy has been turned against itself. The mountains are intact, the weapons are real, the exits are sealed. And in geopolitics, as in everything that depends on actual force rather than the appearance of it, the gap between what you possess and what you can deploy is the gap where strategic reality lives. That gap is where Iran is standing right now. And how long it can stand there, economically, militarily, diplomatically, institutionally, before something breaks in a direction nobody can fully predict, is the question this crisis has not yet answered.